Okay, we are on recording right now, and I'll go ahead and get us kicked off. Well, welcome back everybody to day 3 of the National Wilderness Workshop. We've got a great lineup again today. We just had a wonderful coffee break where we talked about 2 of the challenges to our areas and our organizations. And if you haven't yet taken the survey, you should have a link in your inbox. Go to SurveyMonkey Day 3 NWW. Add your thoughts to the list that we've got started about the biggest challenges that your organization faces, or the biggest challenges to the National Wilderness Preservation System. I'm going to keep that link open throughout today and tomorrow, and then we'll assemble the list of that everybody is contributing to. Lots of great comments in the other section as well for challenges that aren't listed on the survey, and we will I will get that summarized and sent out to everybody on Friday and the last day. So if everybody can do that, that will help us have a bigger impact in terms of understanding what those challenges are, and give us an opportunity to figure out some ways of consolidating our efforts, combining our efforts to address those issues. Again, we're here to talk about wilderness stewardship advocacy in its many forms, and one of those key forms is how we communicate today. We're really pleased that we have Lisa Ronald with us, and Sandy Scrine, who is the past Forest Service Wilderness Specialist or Wilderness Program Leader back in Washington, D.C., to introduce our first panel, which will be talking about transforming our writing and our speech. Then we will have collective impact on sustainable trails in the White Mountains with Melanie Luce. At 2:45 today, we have Dan Williams and Anna Zawazi, who will talk about their program for developing sustainable wilderness stewardship volunteer programs that the Volunteer for Outdoor Colorados has spearheaded, and the success they're having. And finally, today we'll end with Indigenous Wilderness Stewardship from Time Immemorial to Tomorrow with Nathan Regner from Pennsylvania State University. So, Sandy, let's go ahead and I'll just start the session. Just remember, folks, be involved and come join as you can, and we will get this on the road. Sandy.
Thank you, Randy. Good morning, everybody. Sandy Scrine, retired Forest Service, as Randy said. I'm also a board member of the Society for Wilderness Stewardship, our national organization, and I'm also on the board of a local organization here, the Northwoods Volunteer Connection, that works with the Superior National Forest and Body Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. So today's session on transforming writing, photography, and speech has 3 speakers. Each will take about 15 minutes, and then we'll plan for a Q&A session at the end. You can put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and you can also chat with each other in the chat box. So President Biden's administration has embraced diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion as pillars of today's government. The wilderness community is further challenged to embrace, apply, and institutionalize these ideas, starting with how we communicate about wilderness through stories, interactive exercises, examples, and introspective questions. This session will explore inclusive and exclusive wilderness communication norms. With that, we'll first hear from Shelton Johnson. Take it away, Shelton.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction. I thought I would actually share 4 different memories of my experiences working in the national parks. I've been a ranger here in Yosemite for quite some time. I've been a ranger for 33 years, and most of my career now has been here in Yosemite. And when you're dealing with wilderness, and of course most of Yosemite is designated wilderness, you have some other interesting applications in terms of how race and ethnicity and gender and all these different biases can affect that experience, if you will. And so I thought I would just start out by sharing 4 different memories that I think would be specific to that particular type of dialogue or conversation. The first memory that I have was when I started out my career as a park ranger at the west entrance to Yellowstone National Park. So I lived in West Yellowstone, Montana, and it's the busiest entrance to Yellowstone. So the majority of folks visiting the park are come through that entrance. I was the only African-American, not just working at that entrance station. At that point, I was the only African-American park ranger in Yellowstone. I'll say that again. I was the only African-American ranger in Yellowstone at that point. And I was working at the West Gate, and you see visitors and greet visitors that come in from all over the world. And that was one of the most beautiful things about that job. You just never know who you might run into. And at a certain point, what I was not expecting, of course, was to see people who literally looked like me. And then one day, that actually happened. A car pulled up, and it was an African-American family. It was, the husband, the wife, the two daughters in the back seat. And what made this memory so remarkable was the fact that they were an African-American family. It was the first African-American family I had ever encountered. And when they pulled up, the father looked at me, and this is what he said. They all had this look of shock on their faces. And he said, "You are the last thing I expected to see at this entrance station." So I looked back at him and I said, "Well, take a good look, because I'm the only one." And they all started laughing. But the thing that I remember most clearly from that memory was that when the car pulled up, the 2 daughters that were in the back seat looked really distracted. They were like, obviously in that mode of, Mom and Dad want us to do this. I don't want to do this. Why are we doing this? But when they saw me, after traveling through Wyoming and or Montana, the Dakotas, they were not expecting to see someone who looked like them. And so I had the honor and the distinction to welcome this African-American family to the world's first national park. And of all the encounters that I had working at the West Entrance, from working during the Great Fires in 1988 to what have you, that's what I remember most clearly. I remember the power of welcoming someone who looked like themselves, to see themselves reflected at that entrance, the power of that moment. I don't know if they have never forgotten that moment, but I dealt with literally with thousands and thousands of people during that summer. And I remember that family clearly. I remember the expression on the kids' faces. I remember the mom and the dad, and they all were looking at each other. They were looking at me, and it was a reunion, and it felt like family was there to welcome them to their national park. And I always bring up that memory because it was so provocative, it was so powerful, and it was so memorable. And that's why it's important not just to have African Americans visiting these wild spaces and wild places, but to have people who look like the people who are coming, welcoming them as they claim their inheritance of America's best idea. Okay, that's memory 1. It's important. The second memory is not so positive, but I think it's important to share as well. I also worked as a park ranger in Great Basin National Park. I used to conduct tours of Lehman Cave, which used to be known as Lehman Cave National Monument, beautiful limestone solution cavern. Well, it's right on the border with Utah. And at one point, we would get some folks coming in from Utah, from different parts of that region. And this was a family. And there were very large families coming into Great Basin because, as you folks may or may not know, polygamy is still alive and well in certain areas around Nevada and Utah. Well, this family showed up, and I was there to greet them. And I basically said, well, welcome to Yosemite. You folks look like you're one family. And at that point, they have identified themselves as belonging to the Ku Klux Klan. And they were quite serious about that. And so here I was in this position of welcoming a group who has identified themselves as belonging to this white supremacist organization, but I'm the park ranger. And I remember clearly that I was the one that was empowered. I was the one that had the keys to the cave. I was the one who had the responsibility to give them a good tour, regardless of their attitude. I had a job to do. And so what I did was I identified myself. I said, hey, my name is Shelton Johnson. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. And I'll be the person leading you in your tour. I will take you all the way into the cave. And if all goes well, I'll bring all of you out safely. So you want to make certain that nothing happens to me, because, you know, it is the darkest dark imaginable to be in a limestone cave. There's switches that I turn on to illuminate, and then there's switches I turn off behind me. because if there's light sensitivity is an issue in a cave. So you want to make certain, your job is to make certain that nothing happens to me. If nothing happens to me, we're all going to get through this just remarkably well. Are you in? And they just looked at me and just sort of had their eyes were wide open and says, oh yeah, we'll make certain nothing happens to you. This is great, great. And if you have any questions, let me know. And so we started the cave tour, and it was one of the best tours I've ever given. They asked questions. That hostile atmosphere that they began the interaction with dissipated because they recognized that in that situation, I was the one that was in power, but also that I was the one that was trying to provide for them an experience that would be memorable in a good way, not in a bad way. And so it ended up becoming one of the best tours that I've ever given. And they thanked me afterwards, but it began, talk about a rocky beginning when a group identifies themselves as belonging to a supremacist group. So it made me think of the level of power that they felt that they had in that situation and how I had to quickly flip that around to sharing that power and telling them that, no, I'm the one that's leading this program, and I'm here to help you understand the ecology of Lehman Cave. So that's an important memory of both in terms of people's attitudes that we have no control over with regard to race, but how to deal effectively with someone that you run into who doesn't like your appearance, whether it's regard to gender or ethnicity. So that's the second memory. The third memory I would like to share, I was in Washington, D.C., in Anacostia, Southeast D.C., which is a mostly African-American area. And I was showing a film, and actually I started out with a video, or rather a still image that showed a Euro-American couple backpacking in the wilderness, literally. And I was curious about how these kids would react to that image. And so I showed the image, and there's that couple there, and they were Euro-American. You know, there's a whole big thing that's been going on over the years about who is modeling wilderness access. When you look at Eddie Bauer, when you look at REI, and so this was a Euro-American culture, and this was a couple, and this was happening before that dialogue actually began. So the first question that I had was a young man who raised his hand, and this is what he said: "Are they okay? Did they make it out?" So he was looking at this photograph that showed a couple enjoying the wild, enjoying the wilderness, being in a mountain range, being in a forest, but his perception and cultural conditioning was the opposite. His conditioning was they were in a place that they shouldn't have been, and are they going to be okay? And that made me think about what kind of conditioning people of color, communities of color receive about the wilderness experience, because the positive values of that experience were never inflected towards communities of color. We didn't necessarily hear that positive reinforcement of what the wilderness experience can do for one. We usually we weren't inflected towards that type of conversation and that type of positive communication. We heard the negative communication, and the negative communication that was rooted in those kids was reflected of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who lived south of the Mason-Dixon during the height of Jim Crow, who had a completely different perception of being, quote unquote, in the woods. The woods meant white supremacy. The woods meant a place of racial violence. Think of all the thousands of African Americans that were lynched subsequent to the end of the Civil War. That's an institutionalized, internalized memory that African Americans have of the woods. And that's also what was reflected and what was going on in that conversation. So I just think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, that people's view of the wild, we have this positive view, but other cultures may have a completely negative view, and that's what's keeping them out. They don't see that as a positive experience. They see that as a dangerous experience that's potentially filled with peril, so they don't get excited. And part of the problem is, traditionally, African Americans and people of color were not inflected with that positive sense of what wilderness can do for one's spirit, what wilderness can do for one's community, and how it is a reconnection that we all have in common. All human beings, all Homo sapiens are rooted in this experience of being in the wild. But for African Americans, that positive value has been twisted to a negative value because of our history, which is rooted in slavery. So I'm hoping I'm being perfectly clear in that. Okay. All right. The third memory took place. Let's see. I think that was the third memory, wasn't it? So the other memory that I want to say is that, or communicate, is a more positive one. I was in Yosemite National Park in Yosemite Valley, And I was taking young people up to Lower Yosemite Fall in the springtime. I don't know if any of you folks have ever been to Yosemite Valley in the springtime after a great winter snowpack. And the waterfalls are just absolutely amazing. It's actually its own microenvironment to walk to a waterfall in the spring, because you start out and it's completely sunny, blue sky, clear, warm weather. But as you approach the waterfall, you start seeing clouds above you, and the clouds increase in density till eventually you're in a rainstorm. And by the time you get to the bridge at Lower Yosemite Fall, there is a gale blowing over the bridge, and everyone's getting absolutely soaked. And the kids are there just yelling and screaming, and everyone's having fun, but a completely different change of worlds within a matter of an eighth of a mile. Well, there's this one kid who was coming up who was African American. He had never been to a national park before, so he had never been to Yosemite, Yellowstone, any national park. And Yosemite, of course, is mostly wilderness, and that water was flowing from a wilderness environment. Just a few hundred feet above the valley floor is the beginning of the wilderness boundary. And he's looking at the fall, but he didn't walk with the rest of us. He stayed back a bit because he had never seen what he was seeing. And I went back to check to see if he was okay. And this speaks to the mindset that people of color, in particular, especially inner city kids, cannot connect with these types of environments because we are so culturally remote from these experiences. We don't know how to react to them. And that in itself is implicitly rooted in a racist perspective, because connecting with the wild is a connection with human beings, with the world around them. And we all have that in common, that is a common value. And I saw it with that kid. That kid was looking at the falls, and he was so entranced by what he was seeing. I asked him, and I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, and this is a direct quote, he said, "Yeah, I just had no idea that such beauty existed." I'll say that again. I had no idea that such beauty existed. And when he said that, I said to myself, how often look at Eddie Bauer, look at the industry that supports outdoor gear and going out into the wilderness. How often in his past had he seen people who looked like him having the experience he was having that day? Very rarely, hardly ever. And so the result was no one in his community had visited a national park. No one in his community had received any type of notification or announcement from the government that national parks were part of their heritage, were part of their property. So he was not preconditioned to experience Yosemite. And that's why I refer to this as a crisis of translation. We communicate the values of parks, we communicate the values of national forests and wilderness, but that conversation, that communication historically was never inflected toward communities of color. So as a result, they're not aware of this stuff. They know that parks are beautiful, but they have no idea of the profundity of that beauty. And that is a huge part of the problem. They are not aware. And so when he was in Yosemite Valley, one of the most beautiful places in the world, and he was watching this water cascading from the edge of the world from his point of view, and that thunder was around him and that rain was around him, he was astonished by what he was experiencing, because his perception of a park was a city park, where his mother or father might have said, "Don't go to that park after sunset. You know what happens in that park after sunset. There's drug deals, or there's crime, there's all sorts of things going on." So for many African Americans, or some African Americans from a particular milieu, that whole experience of parks is remote. And the closest they can come to it is a translation within their own lives of what park actually means. And for these young people, parks don't mean Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Zion, Canyonlands. They are completely unaware of the power of these places, of the incredible transcendent beauty of these places, because they've not been preconditioned to accept them, because literally the tourism industry was never inflected towards African Americans and people of color as a target audience. That's changing today, but we're living today with what was rooted in yesterday. And that is one of the reasons why there's reticence within these communities to connect, because they were never targets of tourism to begin with. And so we are the least informed when it comes to the values of wilderness, because when you look at the Wilderness Act, when you look at all the proponents of wilderness, it was not presented by people who looked like the communities that we're now trying to reach. And that's a huge part of the problem that we need to look at. We are so indoctrinated into this mindset, into this philosophy, that we forget that there are communities that have not had that privilege. And what we're talking about here, and what I'm talking about, is one of the negative consequences of privilege.
Thank you, Shelton. I don't know about you all, but I love Shelton's stories. Shelton's stories captivate me in an incredibly visceral way. So I'm going to try to follow that. My name is Lisa Ronald, and I am the Wildlands Communications Director at the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana. And I'm going to build on a lot of the things that Shelton was talking about. And we're actually going to do a participatory exercise right now. So I would ask you all to open your chat window, and I'm going to share my screen here. And we're going to do an exercise together. So I'm going to show you a series of images, a series of pictures of how we traditionally and how we have often shown wilderness recreation. And I'd like you to, in the chat, identify two things. I'd like you to identify inclusive elements that you think are missing from the pictures that you see. And I'd like you to identify things that are present in the pictures, things that you see in the pictures that you think are exclusive. So two things, things that are missing and things that are present that you think are exclusive, and go ahead and type those into the chat at any point. So here we go. All right, so here are the pictures all together, and I'm seeing some really thoughtful responses in the chat. So keep those coming. We are going to now sort of summarize and unpack some of this stuff. So looking at the characteristics of these photographs, so the characteristics of the that make up our wilderness recreation norms. Typically, we portray people who recreate in wilderness as being young, as being white, white men in particular, who are very athletic looking and who are often alone. So even though we know, for example, that there was somebody taking the picture itself conveys a narrow definition of solitude by picturing people alone. We also tend to see these young white athletic men who are alone engaging in activities that require a lot of gear, they require skill, they require knowledge, and they require often an appetite for challenge. And that's something we often portray in wilderness is this notion of challenge. And we often have the backdrop for these young white men who are athletic, who are alone, engaging in challenging recreation. The backdrops for these people tend to be remote locations that suggest this pristine notion of nature in the absence of human presence. And so finally, we also tend to portray these young white athletic men who are alone, engaging in challenging recreation in really remote looking places as having a particular type of relationship with nature. And that tends to be a masculine relationship that prioritizes things like strength and endurance and conquest and domination. And so if we think about the type of people and locations and connections that we're including in our typical portrayal of wilderness recreation, who might not see themselves in this typical depiction? And I think Shelton's stories alluded to that several times, about seeing yourself in a particular place or in an activity. So if we have a certain stereotype that we're adhering to, who might be the people that we're excluding unintentionally excluding from wilderness recreation if we're adhering to a particular norm? So we might be excluding people who are older, BIPOC, people who identify as female or have non-binary or fluid gender. We might be excluding people who have disabilities, whether those are visible or invisible disabilities. Families or groups, we tend not to see people pictured in families and groups. And we tend not to see people engaging in calm recreation activities. And so people may very well appreciate the value of challenge in another piece of life, but during their vacation, they may want to engage in a calm recreational activity that doesn't require a lot of money. We may also be excluding people that want to recreate in what feels like a peopled location. That may be a preference, but that may be also a prerequisite for safety. And finally, we might be excluding people that fall outside of this masculine connection stereotype. So people that have different worldviews, different life ways, different ways of communicating with nature. But so what can we do about this? What can we do to break these norms? We can deliberately include a greater diversity of different things. And so I've broken down diversity sort of into 5 different categories here. You have visitors, locations, group sizes, activities, and nature connections. And if you look at each of these as a spectrum, so even the characteristics of visitors, such as like age and gender, you can look at the spectrums. And if we've normally been portraying one end of the spectrum, I would challenge you to think about what it actually looks like to depict the opposite end of the spectrum, so that you have an understanding of what the full spectrum looks like, and then you can make choices about what to present to make your communications more inclusive, so that you're not always defaulting to the particular type of visitor recreating in a pristine area alone, extreme activities in a conquering nature connection, that you're looking at that other end of the spectrum where you have people with different characteristics in locations with evidence of use, in groups, doing different types of easier or more comfortable recreation, or engaging in symbiotic connections with nature. And so as you do this, as you think about how to alter your communications, there are some things to be mindful of. So generally, the really egregious stereotypes I have found are fairly obvious. It is the more subtle and nuanced ones that might be more difficult. So for example, if you have an image of a trail crew and they're at camp and they're fixing a meal, that's a common thing that happens, right? In groups, we have rotating responsibility. So say, for example, though, your picture picks out the 2 women who are the only 2 women who are part of the trail group. They're the ones who are cooking. Everyone else is sort of waiting for the food to be fixed, and everyone else is male. So that might be a real authentic circumstance. However, that sort of an image may be projecting unintentionally some notions of traditional gender roles that may not be desirable. You also want to think about your ratios. So you might be at risk of tokenism if your ratios of different things are pretty different. So for example, if you have 5 vignettes of women and you have 1 woman of color at the end, you might be guilty of tokenism. If you have 5 pictures of white hikers, backpackers, and campers, and you have 1 Latinx family having a picnic, again, you might be at risk of tokenism. You might also be at risk of stereotyping at the same time if you're always defaulting to a Latinx family, for example, having a picnic when you're wanting a picture of people in groups. I would also just watch the gear. Gear is rarely the focus of anything, but it's often one of the subordinate details that can convey some powerful things related to classism. So to be mindful of that. Also to be mindful of the way that if you are steeped in sort of Western culture, Western framing, Western schools of thought, the default organizational frames for information that we often just gravitate to. These are things like chronological order. We often center time as opposed to place or something else. Priority order, so things like top 10 lists. We also ascribe a lot of meaning to things that are first, to things that are last, so to the order of different things, as well as to reductionism, which is exactly what I'm doing right now, bullet points. So reducing things down and compressing them. And then lastly, just to be mindful that when you are trying to include systemically excluded groups and individuals, you really want to do so in an honest and respectful way. And that may mean that you need to do more research, that you may need to ask more questions. You need to pay attention to things like self-identification. How do groups talk about and picture themselves? Assessing context as well. So for example, if you have an image of an Indigenous person that looks like it might have some cultural elements to it, do you have permission to use this? Does this present some stereotypes about how Indigenous people are viewed? Are the cultural elements even publicly appropriate? And are they honest if they're taken out of the lived context in which they were presented? So just thinking about some questions and research that you need to do to make sure that your portrayals are honest. And so lastly, I want to just cover some broader strategies that can help you achieve some alterations in your communications. Forging partnerships can help you understand how diverse groups self-identify and how they connect with wilderness, and thinking broadly about what types of groups exist in your community, and being aware of the trap of conflating affinity groups with user groups. So oftentimes we automatically make the jump to user groups when we think about wilderness, so backcountry skiers or horse packers or whatever. But affinity groups can often be very different from that, and they can be entirely sort of divorced from an activity. So identity is the characteristic that unites affinity groups, and they tend to be groups formed by individuals with common sets of identity characteristics. Commonly, when we communicate with our partners, we often create something and then we ask for a review. And this is a common procedure for us. However, when working with diverse partners, this can be perceived as transactional and inauthentic. So consider instead co-creating with your partners, and that's going to mean bringing your partners in at the ground floor. This requires more time. It also means that you need to be open to a trajectory change. So you might end up in a little bit different place than you thought you might, but this can yield richer products, stronger relationships, and authentic invitations can be the genesis of forging new partners with groups that you haven't worked with previously. So also to be aware that when you are asking for time and capacity and emotional capital from your diverse partners, acknowledge that that can be a greater ask, an ask of greater magnitude than it might be for other people. And be ready and proactive to compensate your partners. So for example, if I am soliciting images from BIPOC photographers, I need to come to that ask with compensation. And I also need to realize that it actually is okay, in the pursuit of equity, to compensate diverse partners or individuals while not necessarily compensating members of the dominant culture. So that equity doesn't necessarily mean everything is exactly equal. And finally, even if you are the most well-meaning of advocates, you are going to make mistakes, and it's going to be awkward. I found that myself. And try not to get stuck on intent. Own your impact if your impact is different than what you intended. And use this as a learning opportunity to approach the process of altering your communications to be more inclusive with an ethic of learning, an ethic of curiosity, and an ethic of humility. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tangy, and she's going to give us some of her insights on what we can learn and how we can connect with some diverse partners using social media. So Tangy, go ahead.
You're on mute, I think.
Not on mute, though. Dang. Can anyone hear me?
Turn up your volume a little bit. We can hear you, but not very well.
Dang. Okay, hold on. Let me see what I can do here. Can you hear me now?
It's very soft. We can hear you, but it's very soft.
Nope, we could not hear that.
Yeah, Tangy, we're not hearing you. So you can try to check your sound settings on your computer. If we have any more difficulties, maybe try calling in on a phone instead of using your computer audio. And if you decide to do that, I'm sure Lisa can fill in a few minutes while we wait for you to join us that way. Sometimes the sound video on your computer will get turned down low on the computer setting versus the setting within an individual application, and that could sometimes cause a conflict. Maybe while we're waiting for Tangy, address a couple of questions that have come up. Andy or Lachlan, you want to do that?
Yeah, sure. I'll
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sandy. All I'm going to do is read. We had just the first question that came in was for Shelton about if you think your experiences, such as the experience with the white supremacist family, would deter other people of color from working for agencies such as the Park Service or other land management agencies.
Should I answer that? Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think it varies from individual to individual, but the thing that I always try to communicate is that if you're a person of color and you work for a land management agency, to a great degree, you're a pioneer, and pioneers by definition have a difficult go of it. It's just there's gonna be some challenges. But at the same time, if you love wilderness, if you love the mountains, the deserts, and so forth, then that's the compensation, that compensation of spirit. But I didn't go into this work expecting it to be an easy ride. I expected that there would be challenges, but for me, Yellowstone was worth the challenge. Yosemite, Great Basin, they've all been worth the challenge. Before that, I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa, and even though I got sick, Liberia was worth the challenge. So sometimes those challenges are there, but you just weigh them. And I've gotten much more out of saying yes to the wild, saying yes to national parks, than if I had said no. And so I brought up those points that I did because I think it's important, but at the same time, it's important to keep everything in balance. And so, yeah, the positives far outweigh the negatives.
Do we have
Tangy,
Tangy
you've been
yet?
able to...
And by the way, just so you folks know, I can keep talking because talking is what I do for a living. So just let me know if there are any other questions.
I just wanted to check to see if Tangy's online yet. If not, we'll give you another
Yeah.
question, Shelton.
Okay.
Yeah, she is.
Okay, I can't hear her.
No, we're still not hearing you, Tangy.
Can't hear you.
Randy, do we need to make that phone dial in a panelist in order to be heard?
Let me see. Yes, probably so.
So Shelton, I'll throw another question out for you while we're working on this.
Okay.
From an anonymous attendee, how can a white person give a better presentation or welcome to people of color?
I think that's really focuses on universals. Just that if a relative was visiting your home, you would do everything in your power to make them feel as comfortable as possible in your own home. And if you're working in a national park or a national forest, BLM land, what have you, any visitor that shows up, your job is to make that person feel that this is their home away from home. And by acknowledging your own internalized bias that you may or may not have, that is one way where you won't trip a landmine and have an explosion beneath because you've said the wrong thing. So I think the key thing is treat everyone the way that you wish to be treated. That's something I learned growing up. And if you treat everyone with that spirit of welcome, that spirit of kinship, I think that you're on solid ground. And we just have to become with this whole thing with race. We have to become comfortable with our own discomfort and then move forward. Acknowledge that that you have this discomfort with talking to people who may look differently from you, have a different religion than you, and acknowledge that, internalize that, and then move forward. And in terms of your actions, treat everyone the way you wish to be treated. That's what I was taught when I was a child. And I think it worked. It worked for my grandmother, who was a Black Indian from Oklahoma Territory. It works today. Treat people the way you wish to be treated, with integrity, with respect, and generosity of spirit. And you're good. You're good.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
All right, let's
Tangy,
try
you should be
Tangy on
able
the
to talk
phone.
now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Well, we are here and we are ready to go. Hi, guys. I'm Tangy Ekasi-Otu, and I work with the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers program for the Forest Service Washington office staff. And I actually came to be involved with public lands through Hispanic Access Foundation, and so getting to take that journey and see how some people included in Welcome to Be and built relationships has made me excited to share strategies for others. And so today I'm going to talk about where we consume media around people's recreation experiences or wilderness. And I really, really love social media and digital platforms because I know a lot of people kind of find themselves struggling and saying, well, I live in a homogenous community, so how can I develop relevant, communication strategies if I don't have personal relationships with people of color? A lot of people are like, I don't have friends that are people of color, and so and that's really critical because relationship building is how we have cultural exchange and understanding. And so I want to share the strategies we can use to do some relationship building and learning about people's personal experiences through social media. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to share some posts that I've saved from some of my favorite content creators on Instagram. I know other folks might use different platforms, but I think Instagram has a really good connected network that allows you to expand your exposure to different groups and content creators in this space of environmental justice and outdoor experiences specifically. So let me just share some of the posts. Okay, so this is my saved post page, and at the top here, I just want to share some of my favorite content creators, and so a couple of them are individuals, and so an individual content creator gives you a lot of insight about their personal experiences, which is really nice, stuff that you might not have the opportunity to see if you don't have an encounter with that person or conversation with them on the trail. And then there's a lot of affinity groups that post content and guidance for how to facilitate a good experience for the communities that they're engaging. And so, a note that I want to make is that oftentimes we'll find people posting different things that we might not agree with, because a lot of these topics about who belongs where and the words that we use and the language that we use around these things can feel divisive, but I encourage folks to listen to people on the opposite end of the spectrum of what you might believe or be comfortable with, simply to understand, because none of the content that it's posted is like the law of the land or something, but just pushing yourself to listen to people's experiences and thoughts around these things is really important. So like, here's an example of an account called Native Power Rangers, and essentially they post content about the landscapes and the cultural connection from the Native community. And so, you know, they highlighted language here, particularly within the archaeological community. And so just getting to hear what those terms mean to them and why they might not be relevant, or they could even be, you know, oppressive towards their community, is a good way to learn. Another content creator I really love is Kina P, and she, like, her thing is that she's a hiker, but she's also a chef. So she goes to these beautiful landscapes, lakes with a view, alpine landscapes. She lives in California, but she goes to a lot of different places in the Pacific Northwest, and she takes a hike. She brings a bunch of amazing food, and she knows all the right equipment, all the leave no trace principles, and she goes out there and she cooks amazing meals. She's also hilarious, so if you actually listen to the narrative, you'll just love listening into all of the stories that she shares in her cooking narrative. But yeah, so this is like a recreation experience that might kind of fall under the radar, that people aren't aware of, that land managers might not be aware of, that advocacy groups might not be aware of, that's actually happening, you know, right in their backyard. And so being able to learn from this and think about, like, whoa, there's way more ways that people connect to the outdoors than I can imagine, is really cool. On top of that, Kina also shares her personal experiences about how she might be feeling when she visited places as well, and how they provide a refuge for her. So for example, she posted this video about like how to make some peach cobbler and stuff. But, you know, even in the midst of that, she's sharing like, you know, this is a season, you know, the wildfires are impacting the community I live in. The Black community is also keeping an eye on the cases regarding Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, and Daniel Prude. And, you know, these are the things that weigh on my heart as I navigate this landscape today. You know, these are types of conversations that you might not be able to have, but that you can learn from in these content creators. Another individual I want to highlight is Chelsea Murphy, and she kind of makes me feel like she's like a big sister in the outdoors, because she provides all of this personal insight about how to navigate some of the less talked about topics in regards to how you visit the outdoors and conduct yourself. So there's just such a wide range of individuals that are posting their content and their favorite things to do. Now, there's also affinity groups. So Latino Outdoors is pretty well integrated with Hispanic Access Foundation, so I'm familiar with them, and they have a lot of different chapters. So they post their events. Like, here's one from a hike that I did with some of my friends. I'm up here in the right corner in this little pool right here. But yeah, I mean, being able to learn like what events did they do, where did they go, and what did they enjoy about it is really cool. And then the spotlighting as well from Latino Conservation Week really stands out to me, because oftentimes we don't even know all of the leaders of color that are in our midst and what they bring to the table specifically. And so being able to read profiles about new folks who are entering this career field and who are having experiences is really important. So there's a wide range of groups here, but if I could just click over to my presentation here, we can kind of talk about what we might do with some of this content that we're consuming. So in regards to analyzing your own content, I think it's really important to do a self-assessment and say, what do I have and what am I missing? And we'll kind of unlock a few questions that you can ask yourself in the midst of that process in the next slide. However, what I just tried to demonstrate that is it's important to consume a wider variety of outdoor and wilderness related content. And I really encourage folks to visit, you know, Instagram or Facebook and look for posts that have tags of the location. So let me demonstrate that to you here. So Kina posted at Sly Park Lake here. It might be a state park, I'm not entirely sure. But if we click on Sly Park Lake, we can actually see all of the posts that folks are making and the experiences that they're having there. So anybody who's tagged that location, you can see what they're doing and what they're saying. And I think that it's important to regularly check these things to read what folks are doing. Like, okay, here's a couple of people being goofy. What did they say about their visit to Slide Park Lake? Oh, we survived and conquered our first family camping trip. What a nice getaway. We shut out the noise technology and enjoyed the moment. You know, that's really important information right there. You know, these folks enjoyed the tranquility of the space and escape from technology. You know, what other types of recreation are people doing? You know, photography and blogging and celebrating with friends, paddle boarding. There's just so much information at our fingertips. So I encourage folks to track that and to make note of it. I also think it's important to collect content from our visitors directly, especially for the places we manage or love or advocate for or visit. And a few ways to do that is through contests where people can submit content, whether it's photography, videos, writing contests, poetry. So a great example and models for that would be like Arts in the Parks, hosted by the National Park Service, or the Share the Experience photo contest from the National Parks Foundation. Because the role that we can play as either managers, advocates, or stewards is to provide the platform to highlight that content when we collect it, whether that's online or on site or in nearby communities. And a big piece of after you collect that content from visitors, it's not only for us to learn from as folks who steward or get to work around these lands, but it's also important to share that content back to the visitors so that new visitors can see the variety of activities that are happening there. And so one example I thought of was to have like a spotlight stories feature where you could have a spotlight on a site or a kiosk where you highlight a visitor, you know, a picture of what they do, their favorite recreation or connection to place, and a story about it. But that's just a few examples. In regards to analyzing what you currently have, here's a few questions you can utilize to think about. And the first question is really important. Where do visitors consume news and media? You know, I mentioned social media, and it's very relevant. It doesn't cover all demographics and all people, but social media is a very relevant place to share information. Do you share information on social media? Do you connect with folks there? Or do folks like to listen to the local news stations? Do they look at the newspapers, these kinds of things? I think it's also important to think about the types of media we have available. Some people are readers, you know, they like to read a lot of words and information, but some people aren't, you know, and imagery is really powerful. So do you have photography? Do you have film? Podcasts are very relevant. A lot of folks find that more approachable if they're on the move or like to meditate to podcasts as they do their work, these kinds of things. There's a whole niche there, you know. And another really critical piece of this is like, do you have music? Do you have art? You know, poetry? Anything that that can really transcend plain language to express cultural connections to place? There's artists everywhere, you know, and there's something about artistic expression that is just more succinct about experience or connection to place than just words. So thinking about diversifying your media types is a really good place to start too. Now, one thing Shelton mentioned the other day that I thought was such a wonderful reminder is that in regards to new visitors, I think oftentimes we forget step one, that folks might not even know what public lands are. You know, what is land management? You know, when you walk around different landscapes or you drive across landscapes, you don't see the lines that you see on a map. And so how do we explain that there are folks who steward these lands, manage them, and actually own them and have different authorities, and there's laws that affect different activities, you know? Like, do you have a step one guide or resource to express that? Or do you only have steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 where we start talking about all these rules and regulations about how to conduct yourself in a wilderness area? I think a lot of people are missing the step one resource. Another note is talking about diversity within the diversity, and I know that sounds kind of silly, but it kind of comes back to stereotypes essentially. Like, it's okay to acknowledge, you know, trends in cultural connections or, you know, ethnic groups' experience or preferences in recreation, but just make sure that's not the only thing you have, because like being from the Latino community, People like to recreate in groups and families, but that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of Latino people that love solitude and quiet as well. So make sure that you, if you're going to try to diversify, that you really represent the full picture of human experience from any group. And then lastly, it kind of goes without saying, trying to analyze and avoid stereotypes, tokenism, any sort of victimization, like only highlighting people for being marginalized, or classism. Now, here are a few resources that we can share afterwards as a follow-up that will, they're just intriguing discussions on language to use, talking about narratives around Native Americans, and other resources, just to really reconsider the words that we use when we express ourselves. So lastly, I guess what I really wanted to do with this conversation is invoke a sense of curiosity, because there's a whole world of content and leaders of color that I just feel like don't have the right platform. You know, they've been here all along and they continue to be here, sharing and trying to advocate for their own communities and engage them. And so I just think there's a huge richness of cultural experiences and recreation that happen in wilderness areas that maybe we're just not taking the time to listen to and reflect back out to our diverse communities across the country. And so I think it's important to sit and kind of think about how you were introduced to wilderness and the relationship building that often happens there, and the intimacy that happens there with having experiences with, you know, parents, mentors, friends, family, etc., and how we might model that for other folks who don't have immediate access to that. I also, you know, as far as trying to grow your curiosity, thinking about like, well, what are my personal preferences and what kind of stuff do I kind of hold a bias against? How can I lean into that? You know, how might my biases kind of interfere with my ability to be inclusive? And then the third point is certainly coming back to what kind of content we consume regarding outdoor experiences, you know, blogs, books, writers, all of these kinds of things. Do you intentionally lean into other communities and seek out stuff that you're not familiar with? And then lastly, I think it's really key overall to reach out to mentors or role models that can really expand your thinking in regards to wilderness experiences, and being able to identify folks from different groups to share that with new visitors, because I just think it's so important that we dispel the myth that someone who grows up in a community who is a minority might start to believe that these things are not for them and that it's just not for them. And it's such a myth. It's just a matter of making those connections. So if you know those leaders of color, you have personal relationships and friendships with them, if you know the prominent figures in history who've contributed to the wilderness movement or conservation, or who have stewarded the land for hundreds, if not thousands of years, we can be sharing these names, you know, bringing light to these faces, so that new folks who are believing the myth that they don't have a human connection to these places will know, you know, where to go. Where can you read about people who look like you that have personal connections with the land, to just really try to squash that myth. So that's what I'll leave you guys with, and it looks like we really pushed it to the end of the hour here, but I appreciate your time, and if you have any further questions, please let me know. I really love this topic.
Thanks so much, Tangy. Lachlan, can you give us Scott's question for maybe Lisa?
Yeah, I'll read the question. And before I do that, I also wanted to ask if maybe Tangy could put up one of her screens with some of those resources so that people could maybe multitask while I read this.
Oh, yeah.
There, you had a few slides with resources that people might want to write down. So many characteristics of traditional wilderness marketing that are not present in traditional wilderness marketing could be considered incompatible with a fundamental definition of wilderness. Do you have thoughts on how we can make wilderness more accessible without altering its very definition? I hope I captured that right.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that was directed to me, and Shelton and Tangy.
Mostly, yeah. Mhm.
Okay, and yeah, Shelton and Tangy, feel free to jump in here. So I mean, I would humbly suggest that there may be some assumptions in this question. That wilderness is always remote, it's always not easy to access, it's always untouched, and I think that some assessment in the ways that Tangy has suggested, and some self-assessment might reveal some different things there. I know from my role in sort of stewarding data for the entire system that all wilderness areas are not remote, and there definitely are those examples. The wilderness system is meant to sort of span a spectrum, and I think that's more what we need to see with our visitors. So I think you can start with your communications. If there is a concern that, like, okay, we don't want to make fundamental changes on the ground, if that is sort of not a space to be thinking in right now, to think about how you portray the values of your place, and the diversity with which you can do that. And that might necessitate sort of leaning into some of the perspectives that are different than your own, and trying to understand that, and trying to understand that, and connecting with some partners to help you have that conversation and to help you explore those differences. And so I think maybe focusing on communications and how you communicate through your website, your brochures, your trailhead billboards, etc. Those sorts of things. Those are a low-hanging fruit in how we can make wilderness more inclusive by presenting those different visitors, those different characteristics.
And Lisa, we have one last question for this session, and then we'll call a close to it. This has to do with advertising specific areas, and maybe either Lisa or Tangy could talk about that. When you advertise a specific area in wilderness on social media, and then it sometimes can lead to social and physical resource damage. This anonymous person mentions when a certain lake or area is posted, it's destroyed that month. This is a real problem expressed by so many managers. Where is the balance in communication?
Tangy, did you want to say anything first? I don't want to monopolize the mic here, but I can certainly speak a little bit to this question.
Sure, yeah, I'll just say a few things and then you can weigh in on that as well. I think that kind of comes back to having a presence on social media to share these kinds of things and these principles with folks, like good practice, like best practices for utilizing social media, and that really comes down to being able to express that to new visitors as well, and talking about these things so that we can provide that guidance. And yeah, certainly there is a sort of a phenomenon within social media that drives people to want to create content at all costs. And so that's a very important thing to consider, but I think that really comes back to making sure that advocates, managers, and stewards are also playing a part in this conversation, rather than having other folks kind of leading the way in that content creation. And learning more about the dynamics of how to utilize social media for exposure on your posts is really critical as well, because there's a whole system of algorithms and hashtags that give posts more attention. And so learning about how to engage in that conversation so that that viewpoint is heard in that space is really important.
Yeah, and I would echo that, and just suggest that communications and social media are not forces that land management agencies can control. So people are going to post what they're going to post, and the solution to that is not sort of a duck and cover and be silent solution. I think Tangy's expressed it, like, get involved and have a voice, so that that voice can be part of this conversation that's going to happen, I think, whether or not it's desired. So being a force and being at the table in that conversation, I think is a tactic for helping to alleviate some of those resource problems that might happen on the ground.
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks so much to Shelton, Tangy and Lisa for their presentation and discussion today. We're going to close out this session, and our next session will begin at 15 minutes past the hour. See everybody then.